So yes, thanks for joining us for our field supervision overview. I'm Lindsay Reinhardt. I'm our field education director. I have with me here Jamie Messer, our online coordinator. Jamie's going to help answer questions in the chat. So if you have questions at any point in time, feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat. We can answer things as we go along. And again, I just really want to appreciate you all for taking time to, partner with us in educating our students. I know some of you have been field instructors for a while and have a lot of experience that you bring to this. Some may be new or considering taking this role on. So we're going to go over a lot of information and again, ask questions as you have them. So this is really what we're going to cover today. First I'm going to go through more of some of kind of the logistics of, what do we require for our student internships and what does that look like? But then we'll look a little bit about educational supervision techniques as well as some best practices in supervision and also kind of pull in some pieces from the code of ethics and how we build that into our supervisory styles. So I have this table of contents here, and I will say, some of these slides are wordy, but I really wanted this presentation to also be a reference. And so this is also posted on our website, and I will send it out to all of you after the presentation with the newest updates. But this slide kind of serves as a table of contents as well. So as many of you probably know, field education is the signature pedagogy of social work. And so we really kind of put it as equal in standing to coursework in social work higher education. And, as many of us think back to our MSW, BSW programs, I don't know about you. I have some brief memories of my faculty, but I sure do remember my field instructors. And so field education is really important. It's one of the most kind of memorable and high impact parts of our education. And your role as a community educator is really critical in our ability to both educate our students and for us to provide an accredited degree program. So again, a big thank you here for all that you do for our students. So as we talk about supervision throughout this training, kind of have it in these three categories. So kind of look at, there's administrative supervision. And this part, this needs to happen or it will become, problematic pretty quickly. And so here's where, you're getting your students oriented, you're training them, teaching them kind of here's the policies and procedures, how do we do things, where do things go? Also kind of some of that behavioral, making sure, scheduling is happening, when do we expect you to be here? So really kind of how do things work and what do they look like? Then we kind of move into this supportive arm of supervision. And, as social workers, we tend to be pretty good at this. And so, this is really about that relationship. We might, really be checking in about how students are doing, how they're experiencing this. This is a good part where, we get into kind of self-care and mentoring and addressing kind of concerns. But that third piece around education, it might be the most likely to be skipped, because we have to be really intentional about making sure this educational piece of supervision happens. And while this is a great part of supervision to happen at any level, this is especially essential when we're supervising interns, that they really are here to learn. There's a lot of things that they're learning in the classroom, but they need to really see how this ties together. And so this part of the supervision, is probably going to be best accomplished by having a supervision agenda and being kind of intentional. And you can put a lot of this on the students to kind of bring in specific code of ethics standards or specific competencies, or kind of bring some topics into supervision so that your supervision space is not just kind of talking about, what happened this week and what are you doing? That's an important piece also, but really kind of tying in some of those bigger competencies and areas as they are really kind of learning and internalizing what does it mean to be a professional social worker. So now I'm going to, again, run through a little bit more of kind of our logistics of how the internships are set up in our program. So our BSW students are all campus-based students, and I want to kind of reference this by saying that we're in the process of changing what this looks like, but this spring, and I know many of you on this call will be supervising BSW students this spring. So this is what it looks like now. This will look different next year. So if you watch this presentation again, it will change in the future. But as it stands, our BSW students, they do a 400-hour internship between January and April. So this tends to be about 28 to 30 hours a week, and this is a generalist placement. We have a couple different programs, degree plans for our MSW. So our generalist students who do not necessarily who tend to have a background in something other than social work, they're going to come into that generalist placement. And if they're a part-time student, which would include all of our online students, they would do this internship in their second year, and it's a 300-hour internship between June and December. Similarly, the full-time students, so this would be, maybe on campus, they would be on campus students, and our full-time students are also doing that 300 hours in their first year. And so this one is usually from October to April. So those are our types of generalist placements. And then moving on into the advanced placements. So all of our MSW students will do an advanced placement. It just may or may not be their first placement. So this is the full year placement. This one's more specialized. So it is a 600-hour placement, either between August and July or August and April, just depending on whether they're full-time or part-time. I have this grid here, and I sent you all out a handout ahead of time. I know this grid isn't super easy to see here, and this is a good reference sheet. So there is a link to this kind of field date and deliverables, and we put a sheet like this together every year. Jamie just put this in the chat as well if you want to take a look at this. So this just kind of gives you an idea, depending on which program your student is in, when does their placement last, what is required of them, when are some of their deadlines. Students are responsible for their own deadlines, but it's useful to have this information. I want to just kind of clarify some of the internship support roles. Some of these titles get confused. And so just kind of being clear who everybody is and what they're all called. So the field instructor will be the social work supervisor. So this is a person who has either a BSW or MSW degree, depending on the level of student, and at least 2 years of practice experience post-degree. So that's kind of that base requirement for our field instructors. This person will provide a minimum of 1 hour a week of this learning-focused supervision. Often the field instructor is going to work at the agency where the student is placed, but sometimes we have external field instructors. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Some students also have a site supervisor. So this is an optional role, but this is the person that is kind of overseeing what the student is doing on a day-to-day. And so if for various reasons the MSW or BSW field instructor is not kind of working closely with the student on a day-to-day, then there might be a designated site supervisor that has a background other than social work, but can provide that kind of day-to-day task-oriented supervision. Then the field faculty liaison is going to be somebody from WVU. So that might be me, Jamie, Tina. Sometimes it's one of our other faculty, but this person instructs the students' field seminar course. So students are always enrolled in a field seminar while they're in their internships. And so this person is, once the placement starts, is your primary point of contact with the school. They're kind of first stop shop if there's troubleshooting and just kind of paying attention to students' progress through the placement. And then our field team has myself and our field coordinators. And so again, Jamie works primarily with our online students and Tina works primarily with our campus-based students. And we oversee the placement process and field education policies. Talked a little bit about the supervision requirement. Again, some of this is more for a reference, but all of our students must have a field instructor with either an MSW or a BSW degree, depending on the program. And then again, if there's somebody that is kind of more closely overseeing their work on a day-to-day, then they might have a site supervisor as well. I did want to talk a little bit about our external field instructors. So some scenarios, we've really been able to expand settings where our students are placed. There are a lot of organizations that are doing really fantastic work that's related to social work, but they don't necessarily have a social worker on staff. And so by utilizing external field instructors, we've been able to place students in more creative settings in this capacity. So an external field instructor really can be any social worker that kind of meets that field instructor requirement that's willing to provide that 1 hour a week of more educationally focused supervision. So, I have my little box in here. If this is something that you are ever interested in doing, please let me know. I'm often looking for volunteer external field instructors. We kind of pull this together in a lot of different ways, but it can be a really fun way to do supervision because you do get to kind of have those big picture conversations without as much of kind of the day-to-day oversight of their activities. So now a little bit about what can a social work intern do? This slide here, really, these are our 9 core competencies, and really that these are broad. And so a lot of what the field instructor is going to do is help kind of connect what the actual day-to-day activities are back to these competencies. And so students really can do, all kinds of activities as long as we tie it back to these 9 core competencies. And so I also like to emphasize here, we have a generalist practice curriculum. And so we want our students to gain practice experience across the micro, meso, and macro levels. Sometimes students' minds kind of go to that micro level. And so if you're in a setting where they're doing more macro work, if you're working more with communities as your clients or organizations as your clients, sometimes that field instructor really needs to help the student kind of understand, okay, who is the client? How do we do an intervention if we're not working directly with people? There's lots of good ways to do this, but sometimes that could be a little bit more confusing for our students. But regardless of what type of setting, we hope that there are some opportunities for our students to get to practice across those levels. We really want to emphasize that our students should both learn and contribute while in their placement. We absolutely have important things that we need them to learn, but we hope that they are value added to your agency as well, and that there are things that they can do and contribute in a way that is valuable. Our students will create a learning contract with input from their supervisors. So they'll do this very early in the placement where they'll look at those 9 competencies that are really, really broad, and they'll kind of pull that into more specific things related to what will they do at your specific setting. And then to give you kind of more specific examples, and any of you that want to share ideas in the chat of things that you might have had social work interns do, feel free to add that there as well. Wide range of things, from direct client support, group facilitation, community outreach. They can do audits, they can do an assessment, they can look for grant applications. So really, again, a very wide range of things. And so this is a great area for you if you have kind of a wish list of things you might like to see happen as well, to think about, what are some projects that your intern might be able to engage in throughout their time there. And, once you meet, the student that you have, they might have their own ideas. And so this is really a nice blend of, what does your agency need? What are your specific student skills and interests? This little slide, like, what can a social work intern not do? And so again, it's really broad on what they can do. Just a couple of things. They cannot transport clients in their own vehicles. There are some very rare exceptions to this, but in general, this is a no. And so this just kind of creates a lot of liability. They shouldn't be engaging in activities without adequate training or supervision. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to be with them all the time. They certainly can do things and work with clients on their own, but you want to make sure that they've gotten the training, that they have the support. If something goes wrong while they're in a client session, where do they go? What do they do with their questions? And so just making sure that you're checking and engaging, that they feel prepared. And we also can push them a little bit too. Just because they are a little bit nervous doesn't mean it's not time for them to go and do it, but making sure that they feel supported in that. And then really this one kind of taking the place of staff roles to the detriment of student learning. So certainly our interns can do things that staff do, but just kind of keeping that primary focus of they are here to learn. We all know that, when you work somewhere, sometimes you just need to do what needs to get done. And for our interns, this might look a little bit different, that we want to make sure that generally the things that they're doing are connecting back to their learning. And I think a note on that, some kind of like menial work that's unconnected to learning in a large quantity. Lots of social work agencies are small facilities. Maybe there is a little bit of everybody does everything. And I think that, I will say I was an executive director of a 2-person organization. We all did some housekeeping chores. And so in that kind of capacity, it would certainly be appropriate for the intern to also be engaging in that. Just say, they shouldn't be the only one making coffee if that's not what the rest of the staff are doing. So you can certainly tie in some of that if it's in the context of, this is how we all contribute to the overall function. As we look at agencies, we just want to make sure that, placements where our students are in line with social work principles and values, that there's adequate work for them to do and adequate supervision. I think those are kind of the biggest things that we are checking for. And I want to give you just kind of a little bit of overview of our curriculum. So again, for the BSW students that will come in this spring, this is the end of their degree plan. So they've generally completed all of their coursework already. So they should be bringing in a good bit of generalist knowledge and have this time to really kind of apply it. And so just to kind of give you a reference, they've taken social welfare policy courses. They've taken methods courses across micro, meso, and macro practice. They've taken a human behavior and social environment, and they've also taken a research and statistics course in addition to other college requirements. A little bit about our MSW regular standing. So again, our MSW regular standing are typically students with undergraduate degrees in fields other than social work. I will say there is a caveat. Every now and then we have a student that got a BSW longer than 8 years ago, in which case they have to go back through. But generally, if you have a regular standing student, they have a background in something else. These are great questions to ask. It's really helpful to kind of find out, what is your student's background? Maybe they came from a communications background and they have an interesting skill set to kind of bring in. So just kind of getting a sense of that. Again, they're taking similar foundation level courses to our bachelor's students, but just kind of on a graduate level. And so this slide gives you a little bit of an idea. And these are kind of sprinkled in alongside. So they may not have had all of these courses before they're in placement, but these are the generalist courses that they'll have kind of throughout the time that they are with you. And then our advanced standing students and all of the students, again, all of the students in the MSW program will get to this year. So the advanced standing students, they come in to the advanced year because they already have a BSW degree. And so these students will have had courses in assessment and diagnosis. They'll have had more advanced level clinical courses. And so that's why, generally they're going to do more. They are able to do clinical placements in their advanced year, but not so much in their foundation year because they haven't had the skills laid for it. So again, great idea as you are meeting your students to kind of get an idea of what their educational plan is, what their background is, because that will kind of help you get a sense. I know sometimes with our graduate students, even if they have even if they're coming into a generalist placement, they might have a lot of professional experience. They might have more maturity. And so while they're still kind of doing the same generalist level social work tasks, they might bring a lot more maturity with them. And so just getting a sense of who is your student as an individual with a context for, where they are in the educational plan. The last piece on curriculum is related to this evaluation research project. So this applies specifically to advanced level MSW students. In the spring semester of their advanced year, they're going to complete an evaluation research course, and they'll be doing an evaluation research project in their field placement. And so these will go hand in hand. This is an aspect, again, where we hope there's value added. That if there's something that needs to be evaluated in your setting that the student can work on. And again, ideally, it is both of use for the student's learning and of use for your setting. So now touching a little bit on Tavera, and by the time you were here with us today, most of you have probably used Tavera in some capacity already. So this is our online field management platform. So we use it in a few capacities. It is a database of agencies. So, from the time that we start meeting with students to get them placed, they are looking on Tavera to get an idea of where they would go. Our sites complete profile forms that are visible to students so that they can kind of look for that information while they're indicating their preferences. We also send out field instructor profiles to have kind of information about our supervisors on file. And then students, while they're in their placements, are going to use Tavera to complete their field documents. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. We also sometimes send communication through Tavera, but we usually use email as well. So field documents, these are going to be pretty similar if you've supervised students from other schools and thinking back to, your own social work field placements. These are pretty similar things. All of our field documents will be submitted through Tavera. I really emphasize they are the responsibility of the student, but they will need involvement and approval from you. The instructor of their course will usually send out a welcome email to all of the field instructors at the beginning of the semester, just kind of giving you a sense of like, these are deadlines, these are what you can expect for the semester. But again, it's the student's responsibility to be driving that. We really spend a lot of time emphasizing to them that they need to communicate with you and give you adequate time to to sign off on their documents and complete assessments. And so a couple things that they're going to do. One is timesheets. So students should be ideally tracking their time each day. That is what we tell them to do, whether or not they're doing it that way or kind of catching up, but it is good practice to track time regularly. So they should be tracking it regularly, but they're going to send it to you once a month. So once a month, they will kind of pull a report and send that to you for signature. These are due to us in their classes by the 5th of the month. So again, in the ideal scenario, the student finishes their work at the end of the month, they pull the report, they send it to you. That gives 5 days for it to get signed and back to us. We can kind of see the document move through Tavera and track that. If the students wait till the last minute, again, that's on them, not on you. And so that's something that you can kind of work on and navigate with them. There are time categories on the timesheets, so kind of different like large buckets of things that they might have done, such as direct client work or observation of others or attending meetings. We give our students, some basic information about how to categorize, but really some of that's just kind of a thought exercise for them. These can be good things for them to talk with you about too. Okay, what did you do and how did you decide to categorize it? I think the main things that we are checking for when we see those timesheets, there's a category for supervision. We want to make sure that they're getting supervision regularly. There's a category called other, which is fine to use in some capacity, but if we're seeing like large amounts of hours in other, we usually kind of know like what is that other? Does it in fact count somewhere else, or what else might that look like? Next, there's reflection logs. And so this is not actually a document that you will see, but we assign them a reflection log generally once a month through their placement, where they're going to pick a couple activities that they did. They're going to kind of connect that to theory, reflect on it a little bit more. It gives us some insight into what it is that they're doing. But this can also be a good deliverable. So if there are things in their learning contract where they said that they were going to do something and then write a reflection about it, they certainly can show it to you as a way of kind of reflecting on that. So feel free to ask them about this, but this is also a space where they reflect when it comes to their faculty field liaison. We don't do process recordings. So, many of us may have done this in our own program. We're not doing that at this point in time, but this is one of those places where we are at least kind of catching on some of that reflection and process. But feel free to assign process recordings if you wish. Next, learning contracts. So these, again, are going to be completed generally within the first kind of 3 to 4 weeks of placement. They should certainly have insight from you, oversight, kind of input from you on what it is that they will be doing. So again, this is going to take those 9 social work competencies. It's going to break it down into practice behaviors, and then the students are going to kind of fill in what are the specific things that they will do in their agency. The learning contract competencies, they're really broad. They fit in lots of different settings. And so really helping students to kind of understand what are the things that they're doing and how will it fit in some of those categories. I strongly suggest to our students that when they work on their learning contracts, they start by making a big list of things that they're going to do, and then plugging that list into the learning contract in kind of that reverse order, rather than starting with the competencies and the practice language, which is so vague, and then kind of turning that into an activity. Sometimes when they do that, they end up kind of writing these statements that are really wordy and don't necessarily mean anything. I think one of my common pieces of feedback when I'm reviewing learning contracts is to say, like, when you sit down to do this activity, like, what is it going to look like? How will your field supervisor know that you did it? So really just kind of helping them. This assignment is early on, and it often overwhelms students, especially at the generalist placement when they haven't done it before. And so really kind of partnering with that through them. They'll complete a draft. They should have input from you as they complete the draft. They'll submit it to their field faculty liaison. We will nearly always send it back to them with some corrections and suggestions and edits. And so then they have a little bit more time to kind of work again with you on tweaking it, making it a little bit more specific usually, and then they'll resubmit it and we will all sign it. So it will be signed by supervisor, by student, and by their field faculty liaison. And there is in the handout sheet as well, there is an example, there are like example learning activities that can be helpful to students to kind of take those and tailor them to their specific settings. And then I also just like to emphasize, again, you as their supervisors are welcome to assign them other activities. If there are things that you would like to see from them that you can give them feedback on, just because we don't assign it as a classroom assignment doesn't mean that you cannot assign it. So you can ask them to do reflections, to make memos, to create presentations, whatever would be useful in your setting. Feel free to add that in, whether that's a specific deliverable in their learning contract or just kind of an assignment that you're giving them as you go. So then we are going to do assessments. We do a midterm field assessment and we do a final field assessment. The midterm ones are due generally about halfway through the placement. The way that this works, it's in Tavera as well. It's going to kind of pull those activities forward from the learning contract, so you're able to see that. The students will complete a self-assessment first, kind of indicating, how well are they doing? What did they accomplish? If there's things that they need to like alter their plans, or they have a plan to work more on a certain area in the next half of the placement. So they're going to kind of give you their insight, and then it will come to you as supervisors. The assessments, they have kind of a Likert scale rating around their competency development, as well as a comment area. If you are in a scenario where there's a site supervisor working with a student on their kind of day-to-day work, that person is going to get the assessment first and then the field instructor second. With the idea being that the site supervisor is probably looking at the student's work a little bit more closely, but might not have a social work background. So the site supervisor can kind of put in as much information as they are comfortable with, and then it will move on to the field instructor who will put their comments in and finish it off. So we kind of get all of that feedback together. Ideally, if there's two supervisor scenario, you are communicating and collaborating, but you will do these one at a time. It kind of moves through each person in cycle, and then it comes to the field faculty liaison. I think, also just kind of indicating that we're really trying to evaluate the students' competency by using the tasks that they say as a measure of that. We're looking at updating this form in the future, but, as you look on it, if they haven't done the task exactly as it says, but you're able to see things that they've done that are going to demonstrate competency or not, that's really what we want you to indicate there and kind of use those activities as indicators more so than the measure itself. Then we get to the final field assessment. And so this is really going to work very much the same way. I think the biggest difference here is that at the midterm assessment, it is expected that there is, still a good bit of room for growth and things that haven't been accomplished yet. Whereas at the final field assessment, we want them to be at least at a kind of a base mark of competency in all of the areas. They certainly might have areas that are stronger than others, but we want them to kind of come in at a 3 or higher in each of their practice behaviors by the end of that final assessment. And so if at any point along the placement, you are starting to have concerns that students' competence isn't at that level, let us know. Let us know these things sooner rather than later so that we can help make a plan. We can come up with interventions early. We never want a student to get to the end and then be surprised that, their work hasn't been adequate. And so along those lines kind of leads me to problem solving. And so we very much hope that all of our students' placements go well and things run smoothly, but sometimes, sometimes there are challenges. So we work through kind of an escalate as necessary process here. And I'll show you this here. And again, there's a link to the field handbook. This is Appendix A, and our field handbook is a little bit more clear than the slide. But really to say, we try whenever possible to avoid terminating a placement. And so, if you are noticing problems, first step, of course, is to address it with the student. If that's not working, let us know. We can have a meeting with you and the student and kind of come up with some techniques to help fix things ideally, but kind of continuing to stay in touch. I get involved kind of as a third level. If you and the field faculty liaison and the student have met and things are not resolving, then we would all meet together. And if we get to a point where a placement needs to be terminated, certainly if a student is not working out at your setting, then that will be valued. But we are hoping that we can kind of work through that process as necessary and ideally fix things before we get to that point. So now kind of looking more broadly, we've talked a lot about our specific processes, but more broadly, as we kind of go from the pre-internship consideration, so you're going to interview a student, really kind of thinking like, what does a student need to know about you and your agency? What expectations, what do they need to know to make an informed decision about whether this will be a good fit for them? And then on your side, what are specific skills or interests or learning styles that you are looking for? What's going to make this a good fit for you? So really just kind of giving some thought to that before the interview. I think that internship interviews have all kind of levels of formality, but we do tell our students to expect to go into a formal interview for the internship. We'd like them to be prepared for that. And if at any point you interview a student and they're not prepared, there are some concerns that you have, please give us that feedback as well. We like to know if there are any obstacles that our students are going to encounter so we can help them along the way. Also, kind of before that internship starts, thinking about, are there trainings or documents or clearances that they're going to need to start the placement so that process can get underway before the internship starts so they don't have a delay. Then, once you have an intern coming, really thinking about how you're going to orient them. Some agencies have kind of a formal orientation process that maybe all staff or interns go to, and that's a great thing if that's something that you have to offer. But if that's not the case, which it isn't for many of our smaller organizations or for kind of our one student coming in, really just thinking about like, what is the student going to need to be oriented? Are there policy and procedure manuals for them to read? Are there any specific orientation sessions? Should they schedule meetings with specific staff members? Can you give them some reading assignments, some website review assignments? really thinking about like, okay, the first day it's coming, what are they going to do? If you are doing lots of client work or things that are interesting for them to shadow, or if there are other people in the agency that they can shadow, those are great things for them to do. If your role is more administrative and you spend a lot of time at your computer, that's probably not going to be that interesting for them to kind of sit and watch you. And so really just kind of thinking in the beginning, before they've kind of gotten their own work and their own projects underway, how are you going to kind of keep them busy, and what assignments can you give them so that you don't have to have that kind of burden all the time, but really just kind of thinking about what do you have ready for them to go. And then thinking about physical space, where will they be? What kind of access do they need? Is there an agency email address that they can use? If that's not possible, if your agency doesn't have a server that will produce an email address, you might consider having them set up, even just a Gmail address that's just for that. I would really encourage that they have an email to use for their work that is, if ideally your work's email, but if not that, then separate from like their school mix email, because they just get inundated with lots of stuff, and it's a good practice in them kind of setting those boundaries and separating things from the get-go. And then, of course, if there's access to keys or technology or logins or other things that they need. So again, just kind of things to think about for the beginning. And as you think about that, considering kind of establishing like some overarching projects, like if there are some larger projects that maybe aren't super time sensitive that they can be working on, these are good to have all along for like slower days. If they're going to put together like a resource binder, or if they're going to kind of review some policies and give some recommendations, just to kind of have something so that when there's not something else for them to do, they kind of always have some baseline projects that they can go back to their space and work on. So some things to consider as we are supervisors. We strongly encourage that you have regularly scheduled supervision. So they need to have this hour a week. Again, settings have all different kinds of scenarios. I know in some settings, your student is working alongside you really closely and you're seeing each other all the time. Regardless of that, I, again, really encourage that you have kind of a standing scheduled hour of supervision. This, again, really lends itself well to that educational part of the supervision so that you can have those more focused conversations. The other thing, again, I think that's really helpful about that kind of scheduled supervision is it allows students to practice determining which things are kind of high priority and which things are low priority. If they have a question and they know that they have supervision in 2 days, for them to kind of determine, is this a question that can wait until my supervision time? Or is this a question that is more urgent and I should go ask right away? And getting the opportunity to practice kind of triaging that themselves is a helpful learning experience in and of itself. In your supervision as well, clarify specific expectations. Where should they be? What does their schedule look like? Making sure that they really should have a standard schedule, so you know exactly when to expect them, when they should be there. If there are changes needed, how should they communicate that with you? Is texting you if they wake up sick, is that okay in your setting? Is that unacceptable in your setting? Just really kind of communicating, what do things need to look like? What is it that you expect of them? And again, recognizing that our students have a wide range of professional experience. Some of them might have a good deal of experience working in a professional setting, and for some of them, this really might be the first time that they've done that. And so you might really need to explain some of these very clearly. This is what we expect when you show up for work in the morning. Being here 5 minutes late, it isn't acceptable in this setting. And then there are settings that are more relaxed, and maybe as long as they're, again, what hasn't worked for you in your setting, and making sure that they have very clear expectations on that. And then along those lines, kind of giving that clear and consistent feedback. I teach an organizational administration class where we talk about lots of management practices. And when we talk about like performance evaluations, it's such a high anxiety thing, and people have, such kind of this negative connotation. And so we really talk about, like, if you're getting feedback all the way along, by the time you get to, your midterm and final assessment, it should just be a documentation of conversations you've been having all along. So it shouldn't be this kind of heightened thing is like, oh, this is the time that I get feedback. We really want to do it, both positive and constructive feedback all the way along, so that they know what they're doing well, they know where their areas of growth are, and that they, feel very clear about how they're standing in their internship. And then this space to kind of explore, why are things done the way that they are? Students are learning about all kinds of things in their classroom experiences. And so ask them to talk about what they're learning in class right now and see how that connects to what you're doing. Give them space to say, I learned about this and I noticed you're doing it this way. Can you tell me about, why you decided to use that approach? And so just kind of creating that space for them to ask those really open why questions, because that's what we really get as a learner, is to kind of have that safe place to ask a lot of those why questions. And that's where we can really kind of connect some of our theory to practice. Other things to consider kind of about your supervisory relationship with students. So, what are things that you want your student to know about you? How are you going to introduce yourself to them beyond kind of who you are? But, what is your professional background? What is your role within the agency? How does that look? Is there context there? A little bit about how you prefer to supervise. What is your style? What are your preferences? And then gaining lots of that same information about your student. What are their prior experiences? What are their learning styles? How do they like to receive feedback? What are some of their professional goals? And really this focus on professional identity. I think that this part is so valuable from this internship, is really getting this space to learn, like, not just I'm learning how to do this job in this setting, but I'm learning how to be a professional social worker, so that when they leave their internship with you and they go wherever it is that they go next, they're kind of carrying those pieces. And so really helping them kind of internalize that social work piece. And this is where too, if you are an external field instructor, or you're the field instructor that isn't doing the day-to-day supervision, this piece is really valuable there, because they're not going to get that component from the site supervisor. They really need this from their social work field instructors. How do we look at this from a social work lens? How might somebody from a different background approach this, and how do we approach it from a social work lens, and what's similar and what is different? And again, just kind of being able to think critically about what does it mean to be a social worker in this setting or others, and kind of exploring career trajectory. So again, great opportunity for sharing, what are the things that you would like them to know, and how do you get to know them in that professional capacity? So virtual considerations, we really learned a lot from COVID. I will say, before COVID, I had a student that asked me about doing a fully remote placement, and I was like, absolutely not. And, then COVID happened, and lots of students did fully remote placements. And so while that's no longer the norm, most of our students are in their setting most of the time, what we have found is that there's a lot more hybrid placements. And we do have some students that do fully remote placements. If that's the way that your agency works, if you're working in a capacity where lots of people are working from home and doing your work remotely, we're at the point right now from our program where we follow your lead. We just want to make sure that there is a structure for students. And I think another thing that we have found as a real value added, as many of us have gotten to a place where our work is a little bit more flexible in this capacity, is finding out, like, are there, maybe they're doing most of their work there in your setting, but are there some projects that are maybe more administrative in nature that they're working on that can be done elsewhere? And if not, that's perfectly fine. I'm certainly not advocating that you have to allow them to work remotely, but just to know that that's okay if that fits the way that your setting works. And sometimes having like a few hours a week that a student is working remotely on some kind of side project, sometimes that really helps them with their kind of busy schedule and figuring out how to make their time fit. So these are just good considerations to have. But either way, really talking about, like, is remote work permitted? If so, what types of things would it be acceptable to do? How often are you going to do this? What kind of accountability is there to show that, yes, you're doing the things that we agreed upon? I'm coming back to this with a structured schedule. And this is, I think, particularly important for students that are doing most of their work remotely. Really making sure that students are understanding that, working remotely is not the same thing as just kind of working when your schedule permits. That, again, if you have like a small project that you're going to spend a few hours here and there on, that's one thing. But if you're doing most of your internship remotely, you really still should have a structured schedule, just like if you were expected to go into the office. And so really being clear, these are the hours when I do my internship. And so that, as a supervisor, and I will share, I have a student that works with me in the field office as an internship, and I've been doing this for a couple years, and this is usually an online student, so we've been doing this remotely. And so we do set up, 2.5 days a week that are her regular internship days. And so really helping her to understand that those are the hours that she's working. If I'm emailing her in between, I'm not expecting her to check those emails when she's not at work. I don't expect her to be accomplishing things in between tasks, that really she should sit down and do her internship on those days that she's scheduled, just like if she was showing up here at work, because they are part-time, these internships, even the ones that are more hours. We want to help them early on develop those boundaries in a way that is helpful. And so again, kind of moving on and looking at this virtual supervision. Virtual supervision is allowable if there are reasons that makes the most sense in your scenario. Strongly encourage a video-enabled supervision. All of our students have Zoom accounts. So again, set that up however it makes most sense, but they do all have access to Zoom. And so if you are not, logistically close to your student, you can do your intern or your supervision that way. But again, we do want you to see them. That nonverbal communication is important. And if you will be doing much meeting virtually, making sure that you're sharing expectations for, how are you going to interact in a virtual space? What kind of expectations are there around kind of settings, privacy, such things. I alluded to this a little bit more before, but these boundaries are really important. And I think we see this on both sides of the spectrum. When should a student respond to emails? And you can give them that feedback in either direction. If they're not getting back to you quickly, then that's an important habit for them to develop, to let them know, I expect you to respond to my email in this amount of time. But similarly, if you have a student that's responding to your emails when they're not meant to be working, helping them to set those too. And I think some of us are probably better at that than others, but really this is a good time also to think about your own work-life boundaries. And you're going to be a model for somebody that is very early in their career. And so how can we really model establishing good boundaries between our different parts of our lives early on? And so having that communication really clearly, and also these boundaries as far as how are students communicating with clients via phone or email to ensure confidentiality. So if your student is reaching out directly to clients, having ways to do this that aren't through their personal email or their personal phone is really important. That opens up all kinds of boundary potential violations. And so these are important discussions to have and to make sure that you have a system in place that they have a way to do that. So, as we talk about a lot of these things, just kind of keeping this focus on adult learners. So we want, our placements to be tailored for, again, students to meet agency needs and their own goals. So kind of finding this happy balance there. So we have the learner centered in that capacity. We want to take their goals and skills and backgrounds into consideration, but also your agency's needs into consideration. We want, our supervisors to be a resource, to have this space for collaboration, developing trust, providing this regular feedback, having honest conversations. These are all things that will help our adult learners kind of feel valued and that they are going to, they're often going to really develop both their confidence and competence at the same time. And that's certainly something that we can see, as we teach them throughout their classes, as they become more confident in what they're doing and more competent, like it really goes hand in hand. So just kind of helping them go up that curve as smoothly as possible. So next, kind of touching on culturally sensitive supervision. And I have pulled an excerpt from the Code of Ethics here, just kind of related to how, we need to demonstrate awareness and cultural humility by engaging in our own critical self-reflection. And so as you think about your supervision style and thinking about, how might you address cultural differences between yourself and your students? Is this something that you have done as a habit before? Is this something that you haven't done, but you want to try to do? And so again, just an area to kind of be thinking about. As we have been talking with our students around diversity, around cultural sensitivity in the field, it's an area that lots of them feel afraid to talk about in supervision. And so, if you are able to bring this up in the first place, that can kind of break that barrier if that's not happening already. And then again, other kind of thoughts for you to consider. Are there strategies that you need for your own development? How open might you or your agency be to being educated by staff and students about racial injustices? This is something that we are, putting a lot more focus on in our curriculum right now, certainly than when I was in school. And so, our students might be learning things that they're able to bring forth. And so having a space, maybe you're not going to be able to make necessarily these changes that they may or may not be suggesting, but having a space to kind of talk about these and see, what direction that you can go in. And then I also want to say we are in the process of updating our curriculum to be in line with the 2022 CSWE, the EPAS, the educational standards. So next year, our field documents will start to look a little bit different because they're going to kind of move to that new those new policies. And in advance of this, we are also doing some training around, ADEI is the language that you're going to see specifically in the field document. So this anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion. So we really want to kind of touch on, what does all of that mean? How do we do a good job kind of creating space for our students? So Jamie is going to be doing a training related to that in January and helping us kind of prepare to supervise our students and really engage in ADEI a little bit more intentionally. And so I also put a link to that registration date on your handout. That will be on January 17th. So we hope that you might be able to join us then as well. You have a little reference here to kind of trauma-informed supervision. Again, many of the practices that we've discussed will incorporate trauma-informed principles. So, things like collaboration, transparency and feedback and expectations, having clear communication. You can use self-disclosure as is appropriate. This is a great way to model, when is self-disclosure appropriate? How do we determine if we should do that? But that can be really valuable for kind of validating. Certainly, lots of our students feeling insecure, needing to grow their confidence. And so just kind of understanding that, we all have these periods of doubt. How did we feel when we were interns? Being able to kind of share our own growth and, how we develop self-confidence in our practice and how we sought supervision. So these things can really help validate our students and help them feel a little bit more secure as they move forward. Next, I want to talk a little bit about self-care. So again, kind of pulling out an excerpt from the Code of Ethics here. I have a link in here as well to kind of some of the 2021 updates to the Code of Ethics regarding self-care. So self-care got added for the first time into the Code of Ethics in 2021. And I attended a webinar about this that I thought was really, really valuable. And one of the things that they really kind of emphasized there was that, they didn't add self-care to the Code of Ethics to create like another kind of thing we have to do. And, certainly not looking for ethics violations to say like, oh, this person is not practicing enough self-care, but that the intention really is to ingrain this more fully into our profession. And so places such as higher education institutes and employment settings really to kind of put the burden on these larger institutions to better operationalize and ingrain self-care into their nature. And so we spend a lot of time talking with our students about self-care. But one of the aspects that, I really have been trying to push on is helping the students to think about the professional side of self-care, that, personal self-care is really important as well, but, how do you manage your time? How do you organize your emails? What does your desk look like? These pieces of professionalism are self-care as well. And so these are great things to kind of build right into a learning contract, but these are also good areas for all of us to kind of reflect on our own self-care. What are our practices? Is this an area we feel like we do a good job in? Because again, we are modeling for students early on. And I think that there is an unfortunate belief that is, too widespread, I think, across our profession that says, social workers are always overworked. We're always going to be stressed. That's just the way that it is. And so really kind of helping students to see, like, here's where I can set boundaries. Here are places I don't take my work home with me. Here's how I take care of myself. Here's how I take vacation, whatever it is. And if, you're in a workplace where it's hard to have self-care, having some honest conversations about that are good as well. So reflecting on, what is the self-care culture within your agency, and really how can you, continue to grow your own self-care, as that's an area we all can always work on, but how do you really guide new social workers as they're establishing healthy habits there? We have lots of our students do a self-care assessment at kind of some part in their field seminar. And so that can be a good thing for them to talk about too. You can ask them at some point in their internship if they've done something like that, if they want to share it. It's an interesting form. There's lots of kind of divides self-care up into lots of different kind of components and has them assess, how are they doing? Are there areas that they want to do better? So again, good area for conversation and supervision, and just a really important area for us to think about, like, what do we say, what do we model, and how do we help instill healthy habits in our social workers so that they, can have long and productive and healthy careers. This next piece kind of looks at developmental stages of an internship. And so obviously all internships are going to be a little bit differently, but this is pulled from some research from Schweitzer and King that just kind of looked at common stages that students go through in internships. And so we have this kind of anticipation stage early on. So this model kind of identifies some tasks. In the anticipation in the anticipation stage, the students, they're excited, they are ready to learn. And so really, this is a time for them to set their goals, consider what they need to achieve, explore some of these expectations and form relationships. Then we get to the disillusionment stage. And, I pulled this out again earlier this fall after our, once we have a cohort of students that have been in their placement about a month, then they start to see like, okay, here's the difference between how great I thought it was, and then here are kind of the challenges that they are, because nothing is perfect, right? So this is kind of that spot where they get to kind of confront their ideals with reality. So they get to kind of acknowledge the gap between their expectations and reality, to have their feelings normalized. Nobody's internship is perfect. No place setting is perfect. Never are you going to work somewhere where every single policy is exactly the way that you would like it to be. There will always be aspects that are challenging, and we can talk about those. What can we change? What can't we? So just kind of normalizing that experience. Then they kind of move in, moving forward from that, we go into this confrontation. Okay, now we've accepted reality. We're going to work through this reality that we have. So there might be some kind of reassessing some of their expectations. Who do they find out really who are good supports for them, internally or externally to the internship and in their academic settings, figuring out what are their strategies. And then we get into this competence stage. Here's this happy part of the internship where they've got it. They've kind of built up, they understand what they're doing. They have built some confidence in how they're doing it. They're able to share. And so we kind of move through that period of time. And then we get to the end, this culmination where we're going to terminate with clients, kind of understand, how are we feeling, processing, how does it feel to terminate? How does it feel when we talk to clients about termination? And so again, you might not move perfectly smoothly through this process, but I think it's good to just kind of be aware, particularly that disillusionment stage. This is really valuable, and this might be a great conversation to have in supervision. A few weeks, a month into the internship, even maybe this is something that they don't feel comfortable talking about, but it could be an area just to kind of say, hey, early on in an internship, it's normal to kind of encounter some things that are different from how you thought they would be. What have been some of the biggest surprises for you as you have started your internship here? So just to kind of open that door a little bit and keep that communication open. And so, as we come to a close, I just really encourage all of you to give some consideration to, what was your own internship like? What relationship did you have with your field instructor? Did you have a positive relationship? What was their supervision style? I was fortunate to have pretty great field instructors. I have often tried to emulate them, but, the opposite can be true as well. Sometimes maybe you didn't have such a good experience and you're really trying to do something very differently from what your experience was. So yeah, just kind of thinking about, where did you come from? What are you going to take with you? And what do you want your style to look like, or any adjustments that you might like to make? And at the end, I have our contact information. And then I'm going to put a link to an evaluation in the chat for this training. If you could please fill that out. So Jamie's put that Qualtrics there, and I'm going to stop sharing and answer any questions that anyone might have.